Look at your news feed right now. A catastrophic atmospheric river is currently drowning Southern California, washing million-dollar homes down the hillsides and into the Pacific Ocean. Half a world away, a massive unseasonal heat wave is buckling train tracks and melting the asphalt in Europe. Down in the Gulf of Mexico, sea surface temperatures are sitting at levels that veteran meteorologists are quietly describing in private group chats as terrifying. And just a few weeks ago, off the coast of Japan, a tectonic fault line that had been completely silent for a decade registered a highly anomalous swarm of deep-focus earthquakes. If you sit down, turn on your television, and watch the evening news, you will see these events reported one by one. The anchor will put on a serious face, talk about the catastrophic flooding in Los Angeles, cut to a 3-minute commercial break for prescription medication, and then come back to talk about the boiling temperatures in the Atlantic. The media treats these events like isolated incidents, like random rolls of the planetary dice. Bad luck. A fluke of nature. A tragic, but ultimately disconnected series of unfortunate events. But what if I told you that the dice are rigged? What if I told you that the flooding in California, the boiling oceans in the Gulf, the freezing of the Texas power grid, and the tectonic whispering in the Pacific are not isolated at all? They are mathematically, physically, and undeniably connected. And the people whose literal job it is to assess global risk, the military intelligence analysts, the reinsurance actuaries sitting in boardrooms in Switzerland, the deep state disaster planners buried in the Pentagon, they already know it. They are looking at the exact same data we are, but they aren't seeing random, independent tragedies. They are seeing the terrifying early stages of a synchronized cascading system failure, and absolutely no one is talking about it. Today, we are going to talk about it. We are going to look at the terrifying science of teleconnections. We are going to peel back the curtain on how a dying ocean current in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic is preparing to violently rewrite the weather map of the American Midwest. We are going to examine why the wealthiest insurance companies on Earth are quietly, systematically abandoning entire American coastal states, armed with private, proprietary predictive models that they absolutely refuse to release to the general public. We are going to explore the deeply controversial, yet increasingly plausible scientific reality that the climate crisis is about to trigger a global seismic crisis. Sit down, turn off your notifications, close your other tabs, because the reality of what is happening to our planet right now is infinitely more terrifying than any science fiction movie you have ever seen. And by the end of this video, you will never look at a weather report the same way again. Let's start with a concept that sounds incredibly boring, but is actually the key to understanding the coming apocalypse. The Earth is a closed thermodynamic system. What does that mean? It means energy doesn't just disappear. It moves, it transfers, it changes form. When you trap an unimaginable amount of excess heat inside the atmosphere, that thermal energy has to go somewhere. For the last 50 years, the oceans have been taking the hit. They have absorbed over 90% of the excess heat generated by human civilization. The oceans have been our planetary heat sink. They have been our invisible silent shield, taking the brunt of the damage so we didn't have to feel it. But the shield is cracking. It is full. And it is starting to bleed that energy back out into the system in ways we are not prepared for. I want you to picture the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. You've probably heard it called the AMOC, or the Gulf Stream. It is a massive, planetary-scale conveyor belt of water. It pulls warm, salty water up from the tropics, dragging it past the eastern seaboard of the United States, all the way up into the freezing depths near Greenland and Iceland. There, the water cools down, gets heavy, sinks to the dark bottom of the abyss, and flows back south. This giant continuous loop is the beating heart of the global climate system. It dictates where the rain falls globally. It dictates where the hurricanes form. And it dictates whether the American Midwest gets a mild, manageable winter or a frozen pipe-bursting death sentence. And right now, that heart is experiencing an arrhythmia. Fresh water from the rapidly melting Greenland ice sheet is pouring into the North Atlantic at a rate that is frankly difficult for the human mind to comprehend. Millions of tons of ancient ice turning into fresh, buoyant water, sitting right on top of the ocean surface. Because it's fresh water, it isn't heavy with salt. It doesn't sink. And because it doesn't sink, the massive planetary conveyor belt is jamming. The AMOC is slowing down. This isn't a theoretical computer model for the year 2100. It is happening right now, beneath the waves. Modern measurements show the AMOC is at its weakest point in over 1,000 years. Some highly controversial studies published just this year suggest it could collapse entirely within our lifetimes. Now, why should you, sitting in a coffee shop in Chicago or driving home from work in Atlanta, care about a patch of cold, fresh water floating near Greenland? Because, as I said, the Earth is a closed system. Everything is connected. When the AMOC slows down, that warm water rushing up from the tropics doesn't just politely vanish. It gets trapped. It piles up. It creates a massive, stagnant traffic jam of boiling water right in the Gulf of Mexico and along the southeastern coast of the United States. It sits there, day after day, absorbing the relentless summer sun, heating up like water in a giant, shallow, planetary bathtub. And warm water is the high-octane aviation fuel for hurricanes. We are no longer dealing with normal hurricane seasons. The historical models are dead. We are now witnessing the birth of hypercanes. These are storms that don't just form and slowly drift toward land over a week, giving FEMA and local governments plenty of time to evacuate the coast. No, these storms explode. We are seeing a terrifying phenomenon called rapid intensification, becoming the new normal. A storm that is a manageable Category 1 on Tuesday morning hits that abnormally trapped pool of boiling water in the Gulf, and it feeds. It devours that energy, and it becomes a catastrophic, map-wiping Category 5 by Wednesday night. The meteorologists on television look shocked every single time it happens. They use words like unprecedented and historic. But the physics aren't shocked. The physics demanded it. The conveyor belt slowed down, the heat piled up, and the energy had to go somewhere. The disaster in the North Atlantic directly engineered the disaster on the Florida coastline. But the connection doesn't stop at the coastline. It goes much deeper. It reaches into the very soil of the American heartland. When the AMOC slows down, it fundamentally alters the temperature gradient of the entire northern hemisphere. This temperature difference between the Arctic and the equator is the invisible engine that drives the jet stream. The jet stream is the river of high-altitude air that steers weather systems across North America. Normally, the jet stream is a tight, fast-moving, disciplined band of wind that keeps the freezing Arctic air locked up tight in the north and pushes storms quickly and predictably across the continent. It's what gives us normal seasons. But as the ocean circulation system breaks down, the atmospheric engine loses its power. The jet stream gets lazy. It starts to wobble. Instead of a tight circle, it creates massive, slow-moving, exaggerated loops that dip deep into the south and reach high into the north. I want you to think back to the Texas freeze of 2021. Millions of people suddenly without power. Water pipes bursting, destroying homes. People literally freezing to death in their own living rooms, wrapped in blankets, in a state internationally famous for its blistering heat. The media, the politicians, and the grid operators all called it a freak occurrence. A once-in-a-century anomaly. A black swan event that no one could have predicted. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a black swan. It was the direct, measurable result of a wobbling jet stream. Because the planetary circulation system was losing its tension. The polar vortex, which is supposed to stay wrapped around the North Pole, broke its invisible leash. It dipped thousands of miles further south than it ever should have, dragging sub-zero Arctic air straight into the heart of the Texas power grid. A grid that was optimized for maximum profit during summer heat, not for resilience against Arctic cold. The slowing ocean currents near Greenland directly caused the freezing of the Texas electrical grid. The disaster in the water engineered the disaster in the sky, which triggered the failure of the infrastructure on the ground. And this is the terrifying pattern that no one in power is willing to talk about publicly. We are not experiencing more disasters. We are experiencing the exact same system failure, expressing itself in different forms across different geographic regions. Let's pivot for a second to something that feels completely unrelated to ocean currents and jet streams: the financial sector, specifically the insurance market. If you want to know what the future actually holds, do not look at politicians. They operate on 2 to 4 year election cycles. And do not look at news anchors. They operate on 24-hour outrage cycles. If you want the cold, brutal truth about the future of the United States, look at the people whose literal job it is to bet trillions of dollars on risk. Look at the actuaries. Look at the insurance conglomerates. Right now, as you watch this, the largest, wealthiest insurance providers in America are quietly executing a mass exodus from the places at highest risk. They are pulling out of Florida, citing uncontrollable hurricane risk. They are abandoning California, citing unmanageable wildfire risk. They are refusing to write new policies for homeowners. They are drastically jacking up premiums for existing customers. And in many cases, they are simply canceling policies altogether and leaving the state. The public explanation fed to the press is always the same, carefully sanitized corporate speak. The regulatory environment is challenging, or the market is too volatile. But behind closed doors, in the heavily guarded boardrooms of Munich Re, Swiss Re, and the massive global reinsurance firms, they are not looking at the news. They are looking at proprietary, supercomputer-driven risk models that would make your stomach turn. They aren't just looking at the increased chance of a single hurricane hitting Miami. They are looking at teleconnections. They are looking at the compounding probabilities of connected, synchronized disasters. These trillion-dollar algorithms are modeling a scenario where a Category 5 hypercane wipes out the power grid of a major coastal city like Houston or Miami. And because the jet stream is broken and wobbling, a massive, stagnant atmospheric heat dome settles over that exact same devastated city 3 days later. Imagine it. Millions of people, no electricity, no air conditioning, no water pressure, because the municipal pumps have no power. Trapped in a 110-degree heat index, surrounded by floodwaters and debris. The death toll from the heat wave would eclipse the death toll from the hurricane by a factor of 10. It would be a mass casualty event on a scale the United States has not seen since the Civil War. The insurance companies see this math. They understand that the Earth is a closed system, and the system is breaking down. They know the dominoes are perfectly lined up, and they are coldly, rationally taking their money off the table and leaving the casino before the first domino falls. And you are being left to hold the bag. You are being told to rely on the Federal Emergency Management Agency. But FEMA is currently operating on a budget, a philosophy, and a structural model designed for the 1990s. They are built to handle one, maybe two localized disasters at a time. A bad storm in Florida, a nasty wildfire in California. They send some trucks, they hand out some bottled water, they set up some cots in a high school gymnasium, and they wait for the area to rebuild. FEMA is fundamentally incapable of responding to a synchronous, multi-region failure. And a synchronous failure is exactly what the physics of teleconnections guarantees is coming. Imagine the broken jet stream creates a massive, weeks-long flash drought across the American Midwest, the breadbasket of the world. Crop yields plummet. Food prices skyrocket globally. At the exact same time, because the oceans are boiling and evaporating massive amounts of moisture into the air, an atmospheric river stalls over the West Coast, causing catastrophic landslides that wash out major interstates, completely severing supply chain infrastructure from the Pacific ports. Simultaneously, the weakened AMOC allows a hypercane to form and slam into the Gulf Coast, taking half of the nation's oil refining capacity offline in a single afternoon. These events do not have to happen in the exact same state to bring the country to its knees. Our modern infrastructure, our food supply, our energy grid, it is all hyper-optimized for maximum financial efficiency. It is not optimized for resilience. We rely on just-in-time delivery for everything. The grocery store shelves in your town hold about 3 days' worth of food. The gas stations hold a few days' worth of fuel. The system works beautifully, like a well-oiled machine, when the environment is stable. But when you introduce simultaneous connected shocks to different parts of the network, the whole thing shatters like glass. The mainstream media isn't connecting these dots because it's too complicated to explain in a soundbite. And frankly, because it's too terrifying. Systemic panic is bad for consumer spending. It's bad for the stock market. It is much, much easier to sell the public the comforting narrative that the Texas freeze was just a fluke, that the California fires are just the result of bad forest management, that the hurricanes are just part of a bad season. But physics doesn't care about our comforting narratives. The thermal energy has already been absorbed. The deep ocean currents are already slowing. The jet stream is already wobbling. The connections are already made. The fuse is already lit. And if you thought the weather was the only thing you had to worry about, you need to brace yourself. Because the sky and the oceans are just the beginning. In the next part of this investigation, we are going to dive into the darkest, most heavily suppressed connection of them all. We are going to look down. We are going to examine how the shifting weight of melting ice caps and rising sea levels is actually altering the immense pressure on the Earth's tectonic plates. We are going to explore the terrifying, highly documented reality that the climate crisis is actively triggering a seismic crisis. We are going to look at the fault lines that are quietly waking up, not just in Japan, but right here beneath our feet in North America. The Cascadia Subduction Zone, the San Andreas. Because when the Earth's crust starts to rebound, the illusion of safety will be shattered permanently. We like to think of the ground beneath our feet as permanent. We look at mountains, valleys, and coastlines, and we see them as static, unmoving fixtures of our reality. They are the solid foundation upon which we build our homes, our cities, and our entire civilization. But from a geological perspective, the Earth's crust is not a solid foundation at all. It is a fragile, incredibly thin skin of rock floating on top of a churning, superheated sea of molten magma. And right now, human activity is systematically changing the weight distribution of that fragile skin. To understand the terrifying link between the climate crisis in our atmosphere and the seismic crisis brewing deep underground, you have to understand a physical concept called glacial isostatic adjustment. It sounds like a dense, academic term, but the reality of it is actually very simple and incredibly dangerous. Imagine a small wooden boat floating in a swimming pool. Now, imagine taking a massive, incredibly heavy block of ice and dropping it right into the center of that boat. What happens? The boat sinks deeper into the water under the immense weight. Now, imagine that the ice block slowly melts. As the water drips away over the side, the weight is lifted off the boat. The boat doesn't just stay where it was. It naturally, inevitably, bounces back up. This exact same mechanical process happens to tectonic plates. For the last 10,000 years, Greenland and Antarctica have been covered in ice sheets that are miles thick. We are talking about billions of tons of frozen water pressing down on the Earth's lithosphere, pushing the continental plates deep into the mantle. But right now, because of the trapped thermal energy we discussed in Part 1, that ice is melting at a rate that geologists are struggling to even model. Hundreds of gigatons of ice are vanishing every single year. As that unimaginable weight is rapidly removed from the land masses, the Earth's crust is doing exactly what that wooden boat does. It is bouncing back. It is literally rebounding upwards. But tectonic plates are not smooth, flexible pieces of wood. They are jagged, brittle, deeply fractured slabs of rock that are violently grinding against one another. When a massive continental plate suddenly starts lifting upward, it changes the stress field of every single fault line connected to it. It alters the friction that holds the tectonic boundaries in place. It takes fault lines that were perfectly stable, perfectly balanced for thousands of years, and suddenly introduces a massive, dynamic, vertical shift in pressure. And the weight doesn't just disappear. That is the crucial, deeply ignored second half of the equation. The billions of tons of water that melt off the ice sheets flow directly into the global ocean. So, while the land masses are losing weight and bouncing up, the ocean floors are suddenly gaining billions of tons of new weight, pressing them down. The oceanic plates are being shoved deeper into the mantle, while the continental plates are lifting. Now, I want you to look at a map of the west coast of the United States. Look at the coastline stretching from Northern California, up through Oregon, Washington, and into British Columbia. This is the home of the Cascadia Subduction Zone. Cascadia is a megathrust fault. It is the exact same type of tectonic boundary that produced the catastrophic 2011 earthquake in Japan and the devastating 2004 earthquake in the Indian Ocean. It is a 700-mile-long invisible line where the massive, dense Pacific oceanic plate is actively shoving itself underneath the lighter North American continental plate. For the last 324 years, this fault has been completely locked. The two plates are stuck together by immense friction, but they are still pushing. They are building up a terrifying, continent-shattering amount of elastic strain. Seismologists already know that Cascadia is mathematically overdue for a full margin rupture, a magnitude 9.0 or larger event, the big one. But here is the terrifying connection that nobody is talking about on the evening news. As the oceans rise, billions of tons of new, heavy water are pressing down directly on top of the subducting oceanic plate right off the coast of Seattle, Portland, and Vancouver. At the exact same time, the massive glaciers of Alaska and the coastal mountains are melting at record speeds, lifting weight off the North American continental plate. We are actively, mechanically, increasing the downward push on the oceanic plate, while decreasing the downward push on the continental plate. We are literally prying the fault line apart. We are reducing the clamping friction that has kept the Cascadia Subduction Zone locked and stable for 3 centuries. We are not just waiting for the earthquake to happen. We are actively engineering the physical conditions required to trigger it prematurely. And when Cascadia finally snaps, the disaster will not look like a Hollywood movie. It will be a localized apocalypse. The ground will not shake for 30 seconds. It will shake violently, aggressively, for 5 to 7 agonizing minutes. Bridges will collapse. The entire Interstate 5 corridor will be shattered. The soil in the valleys will undergo liquefaction, turning solid ground into a soupy quicksand that will swallow foundations whole. And then, 15 to 20 minutes later, a tsunami wave, the height of a 10-story building, will completely erase the coastal communities of the Pacific Northwest. But remember the core theme of our investigation. The Earth is a closed system. Disasters do not happen in isolation. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake does not just release energy locally. It sends seismic waves ripping through the Earth's crust, violently shaking fault lines thousands of miles away. It initiates a process known to geophysicists as dynamic triggering. Just to the south of the Cascadia Subduction Zone lies the most famous fault line on the planet, the San Andreas. The San Andreas is also locked. The southern section, running right past Los Angeles and through the Coachella Valley, has not ruptured in over 300 years. It is currently holding a massive deficit of tectonic stress. It is a loaded gun, pointed directly at the second largest metropolitan economy in the United States. Computer models run by the United States Geological Survey, models that are publicly available but rarely discussed outside of academic circles, show a terrifying vulnerability. A full rupture of the Cascadia Subduction Zone would send low-frequency seismic waves rolling directly down the coast into California. These waves have the physical capability to perturb the locked segments of the San Andreas, acting as the final, fatal jolt that tips a critically stressed fault over the edge. This is the cascading tectonic failure scenario. The megaquake in the Pacific Northwest, triggering the megaquake in Southern California, mere hours or days apart. Millions of people displaced. The largest ports in North America, Los Angeles and Long Beach, completely offline, freezing the global supply chain instantly. The tech infrastructure of Silicon Valley severely damaged. The agricultural heartland of the Central Valley, cut off from water as the ancient aqueducts running directly across the San Andreas Fault, are sheared completely in half. You might be asking yourself, if this physics is known, if the connection between melting ice, shifting weight, and tectonic triggering is documented in peer-reviewed scientific journals, why isn't the government screaming about it from the rooftops? Why isn't the president addressing the nation about the seismic implications of the climate crisis? The answer is deeply cynical, and it revolves entirely around the architecture of our modern institutions. Science today is incredibly siloed. The climatologists who study the melting ice sheets go to their own conferences. The oceanographers who measure sea level rise publish in their own journals. And the seismologists who monitor the fault lines work in entirely different departments, funded by entirely different government grants. There is shockingly little cross-communication. The systems are treated as separate disciplines, even though the Earth operates as a single, unified machine. But more importantly, the establishment absolutely does not want to connect these dots for the general public, because the economic implications are fundamentally unmanageable. If the federal government officially acknowledges that coastal climate change is actively accelerating catastrophic seismic risk, the entire real estate market of the West Coast would instantly collapse. The insurance exodus we discussed in Part 1 would accelerate from a steady retreat into a complete overnight panic. 30-year mortgages would become toxic assets overnight. Trillions of dollars of hypothetical wealth tied up in coastal property from San Diego to Seattle would evaporate. Governments are not designed to solve problems of this magnitude. They are designed to maintain the illusion of stability for as long as possible, to keep the economy moving, to keep consumers spending, and to keep the tax revenue flowing. Acknowledging a synchronized, cascading planetary failure does not fit the political agenda of any administration, anywhere on Earth. So, the data stays buried in academic papers. The warnings are couched in highly technical jargon to avoid causing panic. The term isostatic rebound is used precisely because it sounds boring, preventing the average person from realizing that it actually means the tectonic plates are shifting because we melted the ice. But the Earth does not care about our economic models. It does not care about our political cycles. The physics of weight, pressure, and friction are absolute, and we are seeing the warning signs outside of the United States too. Look at Iceland. Over the past 2 years, Iceland has experienced a massive, unprecedented awakening of its volcanic systems. The Reykjanes Peninsula, which had been dormant for 800 years, is suddenly splitting open, spewing rivers of lava and forcing the evacuation of entire towns. Geologists studying the region are quietly pointing to the rapid melting of Iceland's massive glaciers. As the heavy ice disappears, the crust is rebounding, taking the pressure off the deep magma chambers below. Think of it like taking your thumb off the nozzle of a shaken bottle of champagne. You reduce the pressure, the dissolved gases expand, and the magma violently forces its way to the surface. What is happening in Iceland is a microcosm. It is a live demonstration of exactly what the shifting weight of the climate crisis does to the geology of a region. Now, scale that up. Scale that up to the massive volcanic systems sitting right here in North America. The Cascade Volcanic Arc, Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, Mount Hood. These are stratovolcanoes sitting directly on top of the exact same subduction zone we just talked about. The same fault line that is having its friction altered by melting ice and rising seas. If the megathrust fault ruptures, the sudden, violent shifting of the crust could easily depressurize the magma chambers beneath the Cascade volcanoes, triggering simultaneous or rapid succession eruptions. A catastrophic earthquake followed immediately by skies choked with volcanic ash, grounding all aviation, destroying crops across the Midwest, and plunging the region into a localized volcanic winter. We are pulling the physical pins out of the Earth's safety mechanisms, one by one. We are dealing with an interconnected threat matrix that human civilization has never faced before. The atmosphere is destabilizing the oceans. The oceans are destabilizing the weather patterns. And the shifting weight of the water and ice is actively destabilizing the crust of the Earth itself. But even if you survive the storm, even if your house survives the earthquake, even if you manage to escape the floodwaters and the heat domes, there is a completely different, man-made vulnerability built into our world that is practically begging to be exploited by this cascading failure. Because when the physical world breaks down, the digital world, the invisible grid that keeps you fed, keeps your money accessible, and keeps society from descending into absolute barbarism, goes down with it. In the next part of this investigation, we are going completely off the grid. We are going to look at the horrifying fragility of the modern electrical infrastructure. We are going to explore what actually happens to a major American city when the power goes out, not for a few hours, but for weeks. When the supply chain algorithms crash, when the water treatment plants fail, and when the illusion of a civilized society evaporates in exactly 9 meals. You think the earthquakes and the hurricanes are the scariest part? You are fundamentally underestimating the darkness of human nature when the lights go out. We have spent the last 2 chapters looking at the terrifying physical reality of our planet. We looked at the boiling oceans, the dying currents, the wobbling jet streams, and the tectonic plates that are actively shifting beneath our feet due to the melting of the polar ice. We established that the Earth is a single, interconnected system, and that a failure in one hemisphere mathematically guarantees a cascading failure in another. But as terrifying as a magnitude 9.0 earthquake is, or a Category 5 hypercane stalling over a major city, the actual natural disaster is only the spark. The Earth dropping a bridge or tearing the roof off a building is an acute, localized tragedy. The true horror, the apocalyptic scenario that keeps military strategists and deep state continuity planners awake at night, is what happens to our man-made systems immediately after the physical Earth stops shaking. Because we do not live in the natural world anymore. We live inside a hyper-fragile, hyper-optimized, entirely invisible digital and electrical matrix. And that matrix is not designed to survive the physical world waking up. Let's talk about the American electrical grid. When you flip a light switch, you don't think about where the power comes from. You assume there is a massive, indestructible machine humming away somewhere keeping civilization running. But the grid is not a single machine. It is a patchwork Frankenstein monster of aging, decaying infrastructure, much of it built in the 1950s and 60s, stitched together by complex software algorithms that are constantly trying to balance supply and demand in real time, down to the millisecond. It is arguably the most complex machine ever built by human beings, and it is operating at the absolute razor-thin edge of its capacity every single day. I want you to imagine the cascading tectonic failure we discussed in Part 2. The Cascadia Subduction Zone ruptures, sending shockwaves down the coast, which in turn triggers a massive rupture on the San Andreas. When the ground violently shifts, the high-voltage transmission lines that carry power from the hydroelectric dams in the north and the solar farms in the deserts instantly snap. But electricity doesn't just stop. It has to go somewhere. The massive amount of power surging through those lines suddenly hits a dead end, and it violently rebounds. It creates a catastrophic power surge that races backward through the grid at the speed of light. To protect themselves, the substations and the massive, house-sized step-up transformers have automated safety relays. When they detect this massive anomaly, They trip. They shut themselves down to prevent the transformer from literally catching fire and exploding. But remember, the grid is a balanced ecosystem. When Southern California suddenly loses 20% of its power generation because the lines snapped, the software algorithms instantly try to pull power from neighboring states to make up the difference. They pull from Arizona, from Nevada, from Oregon. But those neighboring grids are also operating near maximum capacity. Suddenly, they are hit with a massive, unexpected demand from California. The surge overloads their lines. Their transformers overheat. Their safety relays trip. This is called a cascading grid failure. It is an electrical domino effect, and it moves faster than human operators can physically react. Within 3 to 4 minutes, a physical earthquake in California has triggered automated, defensive blackouts across the entire western half of the United States. Now, you might be thinking, okay, a blackout. We've had blackouts before. You light some candles. You eat the ice cream before it melts, and the power comes back on the next day. That is what happens during a localized, routine outage. But a systemic, multi-regional grid collapse triggered by a catastrophic physical event is a completely different animal. Because of those massive, house-sized transformers I mentioned, the extra high-voltage transformers, they are the beating heart of the grid. If the safety relays fail, and in a chaotic, unprecedented surge, some of them will, those transformers will overheat, melt down, and destroy themselves. We do not have a warehouse full of spare extra high-voltage transformers sitting around waiting to be used. They are not mass-produced. Each one is a multi-million-dollar, custom-built piece of highly specialized engineering. They weigh up to 400 tons, and almost all of them are manufactured overseas, primarily in Germany and South Korea. The current backlog to order just one of these transformers is 12 to 18 months. If a catastrophic disaster destroys a dozen of these transformers across a major region, there is no quick fix. There is no magical government button to turn the lights back on. You are not looking at a blackout that lasts for 3 days. You are looking at a blackout that lasts for 3 to 6 months. I want you to pause and really, truly visualize what 3 months without electricity actually means for a modern American city. The immediate illusion that shatters is the illusion of water. We take for granted that when we turn the handle on the faucet, clean, pressurized water comes out. But water does not defy gravity on its own. It is pushed through thousands of miles of underground pipes by massive, industrial-scale electric pumps. The moment the grid dies, the pumps die. The water towers begin to drain. Depending on your elevation and the size of your local tower, your taps will run completely dry within 12 to 48 hours. And it's not just the drinking water, it's the sanitation. When the water pressure drops to zero, the toilets stop flushing. Imagine a sprawling, densely populated metropolis like Los Angeles, or Houston, or Chicago. 10 million people. Suddenly, there is no running water. Within 3 days, the biological reality of millions of human beings trapped in a concrete grid without working sanitation begins to manifest. The sewage systems back up. People begin using buckets, dumping human waste into the streets, into the storm drains, into the local rivers. We look at diseases like cholera, dysentery, and typhoid as historical footnotes, things that happen in developing nations or textbooks about the 19th century. But those pathogens are not gone. They are simply kept at bay by electric water treatment plants. The second the electricity stops, the invisible wall protecting our immune systems from the medieval era collapses. Within 2 weeks of a major grid failure, the primary cause of death in a major city will not be the earthquake or the hurricane or the heat wave. It will be waterborne illnesses. But long before the diseases take hold, a much faster, much more violent clock starts ticking. The security apparatus of the United Kingdom's M15 has a famous maxim, coined by their former Director General. It states that society is only ever 9 meals from anarchy. 9 meals. That is 3 days. Our entire food supply chain is built on an algorithmically driven concept called just-in-time delivery. Grocery stores do not have massive stockrooms filled with weeks of extra supplies. The back room of your local supermarket is almost empty. The shelves themselves are the inventory. Every time an item is scanned at the register, a computer automatically sends a signal to a regional distribution center to put another one on a truck for tomorrow morning. It is incredibly efficient, and it is lethally fragile. When the power goes out, the algorithms die. The automated registers go dark. But more importantly, the trucks stop running. The massive distribution centers that feed the cities require electricity to operate their loading docks, their inventory tracking, and their massive refrigeration units. The gas stations that fuel the trucks require electricity to pump the diesel out of the underground tanks. No grid means no fuel. No fuel means no trucks. No trucks means the supermarket shelves are not restocked. When a major disaster hits, a typical grocery store is stripped completely bare by panicked shoppers in less than 6 hours. Day one without power is an adventure. People check on their neighbors. They barbecue the meat from their thawing freezers. There is a sense of community solidarity. Day two is marked by profound discomfort and growing anxiety. The food in the fridge is spoiled. The water taps are coughing dust. The cell phone towers, which run on diesel backup generators, begin to go dark as their fuel tanks run dry. The incredible isolating silence of the digital blackout sets in. You cannot call the police. You cannot text your family. You cannot check the news to see if help is coming. You are entirely, terrifyingly alone in your neighborhood. By day 3, meal number 9, the psychology of the modern citizen fundamentally breaks. The civilized veneer of the 21st century is remarkably thin. It is held in place by the assumption that there will be a tomorrow, that laws will be enforced, and that basic needs will be met by the system. When the system visibly and undeniably abandons the population, the human brain reverts to its most ancient, primitive operating system: survival at all costs. A father who has not been able to give his children water for 2 days does not care about the social contract. He does not care about property laws. He will break down the door of the neighbor he suspects has bottled water, and he will use whatever force is necessary to take it. This is not a cynical dystopian fantasy. It is the documented, historical reality of human behavior in prolonged, resource-starved disaster zones. We saw the terrifying previews of it in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. The looting, the violence, the complete collapse of municipal authority. And that was just one city, surrounded by a functioning nation that was actively trying to send help. Now, project that psychology onto a multi-state grid collapse. Tens of millions of people, plunged into darkness, rapidly dehydrating, with no communication, no police response, and the creeping realization that the cavalry is not coming because the cavalry doesn't have any fuel either. The government knows this. The disaster response planners at FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security are acutely aware of the 9 meals from anarchy timeline. But their contingency plans are not designed to save you. If you look at the unclassified executive orders and the continuity of government protocols that have been established over the last 40 years, the priority is never the rapid stabilization of the civilian population. The priority is the preservation of the state apparatus. When the cascading failure begins, the military and the federal government will retreat to hardened, deeply fortified infrastructure. Facilities like the Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania or Mount Weather in Virginia. Deep underground bunkers equipped with their own independent geothermal power plants, massive underground aquifers, and years' worth of stockpiled MREs. They will secure the strategic military assets. They will secure the continuity of the executive branch, and they will establish localized, heavily armed perimeters around critical federal infrastructure. The cities, the massive, sprawling, grid-dependent civilian populations will essentially be quarantined. The military does not have the manpower or the logistical capability to deliver water and food to 30 million panicked people in a dark urban combat zone. Their protocol in a systemic collapse is containment. Keep the chaos from spreading, protect the core assets of the nation, and wait for the civilian population to reach a state of exhaustion. This is the ultimate, horrifying connection. The boiling oceans weaken the jet stream. The wobbling jet stream creates unprecedented atmospheric pressures and extreme weather anomalies. The melting ice sheets shift the tectonic weight of the continents, unlocking fault lines that have been dormant for centuries. A catastrophic natural trigger occurs. But the Earth doesn't kill civilization. Civilization kills itself. Our hyper-optimized, hyper-fragile infrastructure shatters under the physical strain. The grid collapses. The water stops. The supply chains freeze. And the society that was built on top of that invisible matrix tears itself apart in a matter of days. The people who run the world, the actuaries pulling insurance out of California, the billionaires quietly buying up self-sufficient farmland in New Zealand, the government planners pouring concrete into mountainside bunkers, they have run the simulations. They have seen the math. They know that a system optimized purely for infinite financial growth cannot survive a synchronized physical shock. They are preparing for the bottleneck. They are preparing for the collapse. And they are actively choosing not to tell you. Because if you understood how close we are to the edge of the cliff, You would stop going to work. You would stop paying your mortgage. The economic machine would grind to a halt today rather than tomorrow. But there is one final layer to this conspiracy of silence. Because before the grid completely falls, before the water stops flowing, there is an endgame currently playing out in the financial markets that will determine exactly who is allowed to survive the coming bottleneck and who is designed to be collateral damage. The climate crisis and the seismic crisis are just the physical backdrop. The real war is economic, and it is being waged against the middle class right now, using these very disasters as the weapon. In the fourth and final part of this investigation, we are going to expose the financial endgame. We are going to look at the concept of disaster capitalism on a planetary scale. We are going to uncover how the upcoming collapse of the global real estate market is already being engineered. And most importantly, we are going to talk about what you, the individual sitting there watching this, can actually do to prepare yourself and your family when the system is mathematically designed to abandon you. The physical world is breaking. The digital grid is fragile. But the financial trap has already been sprung. While you are sitting in the dark, rationing the last few bottles of water, listening to the sirens fade and the civil unrest begin to echo down your street, someone else is looking at your neighborhood on a satellite map. But they aren't looking at the tragedy. They are looking at the opportunity. Welcome to the final, and perhaps the most deeply cynical chapter of our investigation, the financial endgame. There is a term used by economists and sociologists to describe what happens to a capitalist system during a catastrophic shock. It is called disaster capitalism. The premise is brutally simple. When a massive crisis hits, a hypercane, an unprecedented earthquake, or a systemic grid failure, the population is entirely distracted by the immediate need to survive. They are traumatized. They are not paying attention to policy changes, zoning laws, or the transfer of wealth. They just want the pain to stop. And in that window of extreme vulnerability, the people who have capital, who have liquidity, and who have patience execute the greatest wealth transfers in human history. I want you to think about what happens after a major coastal city is fundamentally destroyed by a synchronized climate and tectonic event. Let's say Miami or Houston or Los Angeles is hit by the nightmare scenario we discussed in Part 1 and Part 2. The insurance companies, as we already established, have quietly exited the market years prior. So when the middle-class homeowner's house is washed away, or burned to the ground, or leveled by a fault line, they have absolutely no safety net. FEMA might give them a few $1,000s for emergency relocation, but their primary engine of generational wealth, their home, is gone. Their 30-year mortgage, however, still exists. The bank still expects to be paid. Millions of families are suddenly forced into immediate, desperate bankruptcy. They have to sell their destroyed property, the literal dirt it sits on, for pennies on the dollar just to escape the debt. And who is standing there, cash in hand, ready to buy millions of acres of prime, distressed American real estate? It is not other middle-class families. It is the massive, institutional investment firms, the private equity groups, the corporate landlords. They swoop in, buy up entire zip codes of devastated land at rock-bottom prices, and they hold it. They have the billions of dollars required to wait out the crisis. They wait for the federal government to inevitably step in with multi-billion-dollar taxpayer-funded infrastructure grants to rebuild the seawalls, upgrade the power grid, and stabilize the region. Once the area is rebuilt, fortified with state-of-the-art, climate-resilient technology funded by your tax dollars, those institutional investors develop the land. But they don't build single-family homes for the middle class to buy. They build luxury, resilient rental properties. The families who lost everything in the disaster eventually return to their own hometowns, only to find that they are now permanently priced out of homeownership. They become permanent renters, paying premium prices to the exact same corporations that bought their destroyed land for nothing. The disaster is not a glitch in the financial system. For the ultra-wealthy, the disaster is a highly anticipated acquisition strategy. And this acquisition strategy is already moving into its next phase, driven by the algorithms that predict the cascading failures we have been talking about. There is a quiet phenomenon happening right now in the real estate market called managed retreat, or climate gentrification. The elite class, the executives, the actuaries, the tech billionaires, they see the same teleconnection data we went over. They know the coasts are doomed. They know the grid is fragile. So they are quietly moving their capital inland and northward. They are buying up massive tracts of land in the Great Lakes region, where fresh water is abundant and temperatures will remain stable. They are buying massive estates in New Zealand, historically isolated from the world's primary conflict zones and major tectonic threats. They are outfitting these compounds with independent solar microgrids, atmospheric water generators, and enough agricultural capacity to outlast a multi-year global supply chain collapse. As they artificially inflate the real estate prices in these safe zones, the middle and lower classes are physically priced out of survival. The masses are economically forced to remain in the hazard zones, the boiling coasts, the sinking cities, the fault lines, serving as the labor force for the fragile economy until the moment the system shatters. This is the ultimate synchronized failure. The oceans and the atmosphere destabilize the physical world. The physical world shatters the electrical and digital grid. The collapse of the grid breaks down the psychological and social order. And the financial elite use the resulting chaos to finalize the complete acquisition of the planet's remaining stable resources, leaving the rest of humanity locked outside the gates. So, what do you do? If you are watching this, and you feel a sense of overwhelming dread, that is the correct, rational response to the data. But dread is not a survival strategy. Paralysis is exactly what the system expects from you. If you want to survive the bottleneck that is coming, you have to fundamentally change your relationship with the systems you rely on. You have to decouple yourself from the illusion of the matrix. Step 1 is acknowledging that the government is not coming to save you. In a cascading, multi-region failure, FEMA will be immediately overwhelmed. You are your own first responder. You need to establish physical redundancy. I am not talking about buying a bunker. Most of us cannot afford that. I am talking about the 9 meals from anarchy rule. You need a minimum of 30 days of non-perishable food, but more importantly, you need water. Not just bottled water which runs out, but the ability to filter and purify biological and chemical contaminants from local water sources when the municipal pumps die. You need energy independence on a micro scale. When the grid collapses, a gas generator is only good until the gas stations stop pumping. You need portable, ruggedized solar panels and high-capacity lithium iron phosphate power stations. Not to run your air conditioner, but to run your communication equipment, your emergency medical devices, and your water purification systems. But the most important survival tool you can possibly cultivate has nothing to do with gear. It is the one thing the financial elite fundamentally lack, and the one thing that will actually keep you alive when the social contract breaks. Community. The hyper-individualism of modern society is a luxury of a functioning grid. When the lights go out, the lone wolf dies first. You cannot stay awake 24 hours a day to guard your supplies. You cannot grow food, filter water, and provide medical care entirely by yourself. The communities that survive the initial shock of a cascading failure are the ones that immediately organize. You need to know your neighbors. You need to know who has medical training, who has mechanical skills, who has a ham radio setup. You need to build a localized analog network of trust before the digital network of convenience vanishes. The Earth is a closed thermodynamic system. The energy has been trapped. The oceans have absorbed the heat. The ocean currents are choking. The jet streams are violently whipping across the continents. The massive, ancient ice sheets are melting into the sea, altering the very gravitational pressure that holds our tectonic plates together. The fault lines are waking up. The grid is stretched to its absolute breaking point, and the financial models have already priced in your destruction. The disasters are connecting. The dominoes have already been pushed. They are not talking about it because acknowledging it means the end of the profitable illusion. But you do not have the luxury of living in the illusion anymore. You have seen the board. You know how the pieces are moving. Now, it is up to you to prepare for the moment the game ends. If this investigation opened your eyes, if it connected the dots that the mainstream media refuses to connect, then share this video. Send it to someone who needs to wake up. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because as these systems continue to break down, we will be right here, tracking every single anomaly, every single silenced report, and every single warning sign. Drop a comment below and tell me, which of these connected threats terrifies you the most? And what is your first step to getting off the grid? Stay awake, stay prepared, and never forget that when the ground starts shaking and the lights go out, the only person coming to save you is you.